Welcome to the Affirming Village Podcast, where we center neurodivergent voices, affirm diverse ways of being, and empower families, educators, and advocates with knowledge that truly honors the whole learner. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff, a late diagnosed autistic ADHD mental health therapist and non-attorney special education advocate, and Lisa Wright, an ADHD and dyslexic educator and IEP coach. Together, we dig into conversations about neuroaffirming practices, special education, and disability rights. Please remember, nothing shared on this podcast is medical or legal advice, and the views shared here by the host and the guest are their personal opinions. This space is for educational purposes only, to help you feel informed, empowered, and never alone in the village. Welcome back to the Affirming Village Podcast. And if you just came from our episode, When Ego Shows Up at the IEP Table, you're in the right place, because today we're taking that conversation one step further.
Yes, today we are talking about when collaboration breaks down because of one voice.
Sometimes it's not the whole team. It's not policy. It's not practice. It's not even lack of knowledge.
Sometimes it's just one person shifting the tone in the room.
One voice dominating the conversation, dismissing concerns, or shaping the narrative in a way that pulls power away from the learner and the family.
And when that happens, collaboration turns into compliance.
And y'all know we hate compliance.
Mm-hmm.
Curiosity turns into control, and advocacy starts to feel adversarial.
So in this episode, we are unpacking how to recognize a single voice dynamic, how to respond without escalating unnecessarily, when to document, and when to involve administration.
Because advocacy isn't about attacking people, it's about interrupting harm, even when that harm is coming from within the team. So let's talk about it. And just because me and Lisa talked about this before we started filming the episode, when we talk about when to include administration, that does not just mean on-site assistant principal. That can mean having to go outside of the building, and having to go above to the district or above to the state. Because we do know that sometimes when we're talking about one individual controlling the narrative, that individual can be an administrator that's in the building. And you have to look at, kind of that chain of command, so to speak, and where to go outside of it.
Yeah. Unfortunately, sometimes it can be somebody from the district office as well. And then it really is a tricky dynamic. But it's really not uncommon when there's kind of a breakdown in the IEP process that it's not a whole team kind of a thing. It really is one or two folks that are bringing ego into the room or bringing their own kind of personal agenda or are just stuck on, being ridiculous, I say, that halts the process. And so there's this really there's lots of sort of intricate dynamics that are happening, right? Where there might be folks on the team that really are there centering the learner and their lived experience and wanting to be curious and advocate for what they feel the learner needs in order to access their education. But they have a colleague or a superior that is not doing that same work. They're not showing up in that same way. And so they're feeling the impact of this as well. And it's really a tricky dynamic. And it really varies, sort of how to navigate these waters varies based on who it is that voice that's interrupting what otherwise would be a collaborative process.
Yeah, because what we're talking about in that regard is really that, power dynamic, right? Because there's a difference between battling ableism from a specific related service provider versus battling ableism for the special educator and case manager, versus battling that with the general education teacher. That's where the learner primarily is, or where we're hoping the learner will have access to. And then somebody that has the ability to kind of control the entire team dynamics. And even if they're not it's kind of backing up when we talk about that power and that controlling of dynamics. I have seen where a school psychologist, for example, because they are supposed to be the ones knowledgeable on the mental health side, on the eligibility side, I have seen where the team will default to this individual. And
Sure.
so if they are not curious and open and listening and responsive and willing to learn, they can really color the rest of the team's perception, and that the team can feel like, we think we're doing the right things, right? And so where I've seen this really come into play, and where I've seen that conflict then arise and then egos brought to the table, and then it's that kind of one against the rest of the team, is because I'm also a mental health professional.
Right.
And so when I come in and then I subsequently go, well, not quite exactly, which I don't say it that way, but I try and make it a collaborative process. Sometimes I do end up having to call out the other mental health professional in the room. And then you can see how the team's wheels start turning and they start being receptive and open and responsive and tell me more. And then subsequently, this individual becomes defensive. And now it's become about proving they're correct instead of acknowledging that there's different viewpoints and perspectives, and one can cause harm and one cannot.
Right. Right. No, absolutely. I'm all the wheels spinning like at the same time, right? Because I think that that dynamic that you just named is really common, right? That um there'll be, say, a related service provider or a teacher, right? Like I'm thinking of an example. I kind of referenced it in the last episode that we did, where a psychologist was sort of holding firm on their perspective on eligibility and all the things, right? And so the other folks at the table were sort of defaulting, like, well, they did the testing and they're the psychologist and they understand the eligibility categories, and so um, you know, even if it doesn't fully feel right to me,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to step on their toes and I'm not quite sure, right? And so in that particular case, like it was the example that I shared where I said if I was the parent, I would have thought, I have no idea what the hell to say to you, right?
Right,
Because they
right.
they were quite good at the gaslighting and the like Jedi mind trick, like you don't see this and I'm right because I have this title.
Mm-hmm.
Um and you know, I use their data again, like against them essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And then I grounded their findings that they chose to ignore in that learner's lived experience. And
Mm-hmm.
I, without necessarily using the words, although I was pretty blunt, um, because they were pushing for ED and I have lots of
Mm.
issues with that.
Which is
Uh,
emotionally disturbed,
yes,
or
thank you.
EBD, emotionally behaviorally disturbed, which often we'll find learners with dysregulation are labeled with, when they can actually be labeled with other health impairment, or a lot of times the category that'll fit for them will be autism.
Right, exactly. And here in California, they changed it to emotional disability, but it's all the same thing, and the
Mm-hmm.
stigma that goes along with it is the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so as I sort of described my understanding of this learner's experience
Mm-hmm.
and the data that they had culled through their report, but
Mm-hmm.
I sort of interpreted it differently and shared how some of what they were seeing as like these separate things were interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
I had the rest of the room nodding along.
Mm-hmm.
And what was really interesting, and this happens sometimes, and it happened in this situation, other team members reached out to the family to like, hey, your advocate was really helpful and it was so great to learn from them. And like, right. And I don't say that to toot my own horn. I say that to lift up the dynamic that there are times, I've had this happen a number of times, where it's
Mm-hmm.
so clear that it's one or two people that are really pivoting the dynamic in the room,
Absolutely.
and that everybody else is really showing up and giving a shit.
Right.
And they will reach out to the parent and if we have sort of lifted that up and addressed it, or as respectfully as humanly possible, like shut it down, they
Mm-hmm.
will say, like, I'm really glad you guys kind of called a spade.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's really tricky. Like, there was a situation I had the other day, and I think this is sort of where both of these episodes were a little bit born out of, was I had an IEP meeting earlier this week where the classroom teacher has been in the classroom for a really, really, really long time. And um, I think that we should be, you know, taking up some collection to buy a retirement present. It's time. um, and it's a young learner, and they just have kind of that like old school, kind of outdated ideas on autism and disability,
Right.
outdated understanding of dysregulation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sort of confusing, um, just even just typical kind of childhood development, and like trying
Mm-hmm.
things on and figuring things out, and like dynamics
Mm-hmm.
on in schools
Mm-hmm.
with code of conduct,
Mm-hmm.
unkind, disrespectful kind of nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in this particular case, lack of empathy on the part of the autistic human, right? Like Destiny put out a reel after she and I had a little back and forth voice message because
Yes.
it was triggering for her. But these episodes are born out of that. And really what ended up happening in this meeting at one point was the teacher was basically saying this young person is unkind.
Mm-hmm.
And they got really stuck in ego of like, that doesn't happen in my classroom. Like, that child is the outlier
Mm-hmm.
who uses that kind of language or whatever, says those kinds of things. And it's an only child with a single parent. And the mom was like, let's start with my child is incredibly kind. And this isn't anything that they're exposed to in the home setting
Mm-hmm.
because it's just the two of us. So they don't
Mm-hmm.
have a sibling, they don't have, right? Like, they are picking up and trying on some of these, like, you can't play with me type things in the school setting.
Social dynamics.
Right. Like, that's where they're learning, which even if children have siblings and have dynamics happening at
Right,
home,
right.
the
They're gonna try
school
and pick
is
up, they're gonna mimic things they see and see if that works for them. Yeah.
right. They're figuring it out. And then, like I said, this is a young elementary school learner, right? Like early elementary, and like figuring it out. And this teacher was just stuck on, nope, they're the outlier. No learner on this campus. I'm like, give me a freaking break. Are you kidding me here? Right. And she was really like, and the mom got pissed, and she was like, you're lying about my child. And the teacher got really mad and was like, I do not lie. Like, and it started to kind of do the thing. And if
Mm-hmm.
you see me, I'm like showing my hands escalating. Woohoo. And the principal just jumped in and was like, I'm going to respectfully dissent. Like, I hear that all the time on this campus from many learners, regardless of like which classroom they're placed in.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a common thing we hear, especially from our younger learners, as they're figuring out those social dynamics. And so I'm quite certain that your child has picked this up at school, and this is how we can support that learning. And like, I agree, we need to move away from this binary of kind or unkind. Now,
Mm-hmm.
she was the one that took it to the lack of empathy piece. So then I had to step in and school everybody at the table about that. But it was a really interesting dynamic, because when you have a classroom teacher that's kind of stuck, and then the parent understandably reacted and was like, that's just not possible.
Mm-hmm.
Like, kids have potential to say crummy things, and it's not necessarily a reflection of character. It's a reflection of learning and the dynamics in a social space, like a comprehensive school site, right?
Right.
And they're trying to figure it out, right? Um anyway, it was really interesting that when the parent reacted, ego really showed up.
Right.
And had the principal not stepped in, right? Like, had it been the principal that was no child on this campus, right? We would have had a
Right,
trickier
right.
situation. But because it was a
Hmm.
classroom teacher and the principal who's out on the yard all the time was able to like offer a more accurate counter narrative,
Hmm.
it was able to shut down. And so I think that it really is important to kind of recognize how dynamics shift depending on who the person is that's showing up in a way that's sort of sabotaging the process.
Absolutely. And I think also, again, it's like there's a teacher listening to this right now, that's going, well, of course, that's what the principal said, right? and and I'm saying that because that's another example of like not centering the learner, right?
Right,
But I mean, no, absolutely. I think what you're getting at is how we have, depending on that member, like we said, depending on their role, but also you bring to it the other side, right? Depending on the person diffusing it, depending on what's being said or the approach. I've had situations where in the meeting they're like, "Thank you, Dr. Huff. Yes, that is what I think that is a very valid point, and I think that is what we're kind of looking at from different sides." And sometimes I'm like, "Yeah, I agree," and then sometimes I have to go, "Well, respectfully, I don't think so. I think that you're stating this, and the parent is stating this." And that's two different views and perspectives. And sometimes that is received well. And sometimes it's received, not so well, as in like, so you're trying to say we're not doing this. And I actually had that in an IEP meeting the other day where it was stated that way, where it was like, it's very clear they're not doing the thing. And after one staff member who is doing the thing spoke up, all of a sudden now everyone's doing the thing. And it's like, no, you're not. And mom and I were in agreement. And sometimes I will text my parents and tell them, like, we're just going to move on
right,
because we're just going to agree to disagree on that. The point is, moving forward, that we know that this is what you're supposed to be doing, right? But sometimes you can see it shift in that other way where you get the nods, you get the nonverbal
right,
confirmation of agreement with the parent, but then not the verbal, right? And so I think sometimes too, you know, it's important for those, just as a like kind of like as a side note, right? When we're talking about having that one team member, sometimes one team member speaking up can make the difference,
oh
right?
yeah,
Saying like, and I've had that happen, and I've said this before in episodes we've done, especially in part one of the season, where I've had like related service providers giving like such incredible, unique insight because a lot of times they're doing the one-to-one in small group already with the learner,
right,
regardless of if they're in a quote unquote self-contained setting or they're in gen ed full time. They're doing those smaller sessions. And so they've noted like they're regulated with this or dysregulated with that, or these things are triggering.
right,
I think on the other side, one of the things that you're getting to too, like we had talked about, again, go back if you haven't listened to the ego episode and then come listen to this one. They are connected. Um, is that expertise that we can get very protective over, and then sometimes, and then when I say we, I'm talking about whichever adult on the team is getting very protective over their title, their role, their position, their seniority, their years, whatever. And
right,
they're almost willing to burn it all down, right, to be right, even when it conflicts with the remainder of the team.
right,
So I have seen where a team member has stood their ground on whatever it is they're saying that is often unkind about the learner and often unkind about the learner's behavior, which also demonstrates a lack of understanding of the learner's disability, right? And they've stood like 10 toes down on it just because it's what I said and I'm a professional and I know what I'm talking about. And I've seen where other team members are subsequently um, uncomfortable
right,
because I'm not a speech therapist. I'm not an occupational therapist. I'm not a mental health professional, right?
Right.
That's how they feel. And so while they're like, I have a different view, and you'll hear it when they go through their present levels, right? You'll
Right.
hear how they each talk about this learner. You get a good idea. And, Lisa's been doing this longer than I have. But I think both of us would say, like, when we hear those present levels, when we hear you go over an evaluation you've done, an observation that you've done, the goals you're working on, the sessions you've had with that learner, we get a pretty good idea of how you perceive this learner.
Absolutely.
And so you'll all and so when you have that one team member that you're like, that's not even in line with the other things I'm hearing,
Right.
then you get into this conflict too of the team not wanting to turn on the team, forgetting that an IEP team consists of the parent and the learner as well.
Right.
And I think in that situation, right, because we talk about like that problem solving and what you do, a lot of times I like to, just like Lisa mentioned, going back to the data. I'm very big on that with my families. When they come to me and say, I feel like they're not doing this or that or this, I'm like, let's look at the data. And I think we often classify data as one thing, right? So it's often the objective standardized testing that was done. But schools do qualitative pieces all the time. They do observations, they do interviews, right? They give their perception into things. And so in that situation, I go back to the data and I'm like, well, such and such is noting this and such is noting this. And often what I'm doing is not saying they're saying kind things and you're not, because we don't go by that narrative. What I'm often doing is going, you're noting that they're never on task, this, or that. And they're noting that they notice that they are on task when they have them in the morning and you have them in the afternoon. So could it be an afternoon thing? And so I'm often asking questions to help them get curious or have someone at least, as Lisa always says, lift that up so that we can document that. Because sometimes, and this is just the reality of it, sometimes that team member may not change their stance. And
100%.
you have to figure out how to get the remainder of the team to also subsequently stand 10 toes down on what they're saying about the learner and have that weave throughout the IEP. And it goes back to what Lisa was saying about with the principal. It can often depend on the person in charge of ultimately documenting or saying or making that call or decision for that to go in that more positive direction. And that can get very complicated.
Yeah. I had two totally like different thoughts while you were talking.
That tracks. That's
Let's see if I can hold on to them because they don't really necessarily have anything to do with each other. The first one, as you were sort of describing that dynamic of sort of getting a feel for different folks' perspectives based on how they sort of frame the learner and their present
Mhm,
levels, it made me think of a situation where it was a triennial review,
mhm, mhm,
and non-speaking learner.
mhm,
And there was one related service provider who felt like was stuck on, if you've seen my Instagram, I have a number of posts on something called cognitive referencing, where essentially what that is, and it happens a lot with non-speakers, is
mhm,
that there's an assumption that there's an intellectual disability because
mhm,
there's a conceptualization that ability to speak is equal to ability to think.
mhm,
And we can't reliably test cognition in a
mhm,
human that doesn't have a reliable communication system,
mhm.
right? So the unsafe assumption is that they can't learn. And even if somebody is intellectually disabled, they have capacity to learn,
Right.
capacity to think, right? Let's
Mhm.
presume competence here. But I see this a lot with my non-speakers that
Mhm.
there's an
Same.
assumption that there's an intellectual disability at play. And so then there's this denial of access. And so it can happen with related service providers, hopefully less often than not, where they look at sort of lack of progress or lack of development in terms of speech or
I know
motor
exactly which
skills
one
or
you're talking
whatever. And
about.
they say, well, they don't need this related service because their skill level matches their like intellectual development level, and therefore like I don't have to provide the thing, right? And so in
Which
this
is just your way of saying you're unwilling to learn how to support a learner that doesn't fit the norm
right, it's your way of saying that you're an
to you.
ableist piece of shit. I'm just going to call it like it is. I'm sorry, but I'm not.
Lisa is on fire today.
I'm over it. So in this particular situation, there was one related service provider who had alerted the family, provided their report. The development in this area, this like there was an 11-year gap in development of sort of assessed solid skills to
Mm-hmm.
this young person's age. 11-year
Mm-hmm.
difference or 10-year difference, excuse me, I exaggerated. 10-year difference. We got a non-speaker, right? Like we have to be considering motor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just going to name it that it was the OT that was like, they don't qualify anymore. They need to graduate out
I
from the
mean,
15 minutes a month of consult
I thought that was clear, but it's
that they.
because we do this every day. Yes. I was like, it's obviously the OT who said this.
So I lost my mind when I found out the day before when I connected with the parent that like this was
Mm-hmm.
the direction we were going. And I was
Understandable.
like pretty much over my dead body. Like that's how this works.
Mm-hmm.
And the parent knew that it didn't seem right, but like
Mm-hmm.
they didn't know how to fight it. They didn't understand. I was like, don't even like, I'm not sure you even want me in the room because I'm not sure I can be polite. And she was like, no, please come. Right. So anyway, I decided it was a triennial, right? So folks go through their reports, they talk about the present levels, this and that. And I am listening to educator and service related service provider and psych and right person after person after person
Mm-hmm.
speak about this learner with so much love, so much respect, so much curiosity. Was there some ignorance interwoven through? Sure. But there was
Mm-hmm.
really good heart, really sort of centering the learner with every single person. And so I decided to just really listen. I asked a couple questions early on, just out of curiosity, but really I was listening.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we got to the OT, who was like, my work here, which I've done none, is done, I was like, have
Right there, which
a
I
question.
it's done.
Right. And what I was able to do was like basically weave together what
Mm-hmm.
everybody had shared.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked some questions while I was doing it. Like, when you said this, does it look like this? And the teacher was like, oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. And I'm like, I'm not an occupational therapist, which is why I think it's so important to have an occupational therapist with that expertise as a really solid voice in this process.
Look at you
Wink,
sprinkling on
nudge,
top.
nudge.
Look at you.
I was like, one of the through threads I'm seeing here
Mm-hmm.
are differences in motor development and motor skills. And I said, so I have deep concerns
Mm-hmm.
about, I said, I can't even believe that at this point, this young person doesn't have direct services. That makes no sense to me. And I said, we need that perspective, that voice, and this learner requires that direct support in order to access, because I'm hearing how those challenges are impacting access in the classroom. I hear how they're impacting kind of the mental health piece and the socialization piece. I'm hearing how it's impacting communication. And
Mm-hmm.
so, like, we need to revisit this because nobody's graduated from anything, basically. This is a young person that's receiving adaptive PE,
Mm.
right? So the
Now,
program
come on,
specialist who was in,
ma'am.
I mean, really, like, it was almost funny. except it
Like,
wasn't
you
fitting.
can't be
So
serious right
bad.
now. That's
So
wild.
the like program specialist didn't shut it down. And he was like, well, can we just stick a pin in this and like hear from the APE, adaptive PE teacher
Mm-hmm.
first? I was like, great. So she comes on and she's like, Lisa, I recognize you from the meeting like the year before when this learner was at a different school site. So like she was the only person I didn't know. And I was like, oh, that meeting hadn't gone terribly well either. You must just think I'm dandy, right? But she very clearly had a ton of respect for this young person as well. And so the way she talked about him and talked about like the gross motor development and all the
Mm-hmm.
things, right? It was just like so obvious that motor development and challenges in that area, the motor planning piece, the apraxia piece, was
Mm-hmm.
a major barrier to access. And that the idea of not providing direct support was literal lunacy. And so like we got back to the OT who became very frazzled, right? Their ego very much so entered the room, and I named it. I was like, I'm not an attorney and I don't pretend to be one, but that is a direct violation of IDEA. Like eligibility is based on individual needs. How are you going to say that a young person who like per your data has solid skills through like this age group, which is 10 years difference from actual age,
Mm-hmm.
is accessing their education without the direct support of your services. And so they ended up landing on that they would continue with the 15 minutes a month of consult. And I wanted to say, don't hurt yourself. But it also became this dynamic of the parent actually not trusting this person, this provider. Right. And so I just said, because the program specialist didn't really know what to do, I just said, offline, we are going to explore our procedural safeguards and make a determination about what our next steps will be. And we may or may not seek out an independent educational evaluation. Like we may press, and we haven't yet decided that. And I'm thinking, do you want this person even anywhere near your child? And this learner is transitioning. So like they're going into like a they're going from elementary to middle. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's like we're going to have a whole new team in a couple of months. And so do we just stick a pin in this, take the 15 minutes of
Mm-hmm.
garbage consultation, and when we get to the middle school team, say, hey, we need to completely revisit this because this is wild.
I mean, I don't even want your consultation. Like, no, but what I mean, but what you're talking about is you're talking about is that broken trust piece. And I've seen that happen where that one team member, let's say they have a conversation offline. Let's say they have, and a lot of times where I see them like come back with a little bit of a shift is their conversation offline is often with an administrator. Or let's say, it's a special education director that has a conversation with them, because I've seen situations where what you just called, like the director may not necessarily want to put that staff member on blast in the meeting, but they're also aware of what you're saying, or it gets back to them by someone else below them that's at the meeting. And it's like, yeah, that's not okay. Like, we cannot do it. I've had the district call my parents after a meeting and apologize for certain things because they're like, we don't want to go down that road and that was not okay. So, but what you're getting at too, though, is that, like, yeah, that broken trust and that piece of like, and again, going back to my own situation with my son, like the speech therapist, like he has, he can speak. They felt like he was autistic. He has no pragmatic issues, and in that situation, again, as I was reflecting and moving forward, I was able to realize that was because they felt like all of the decisions he was making were of his choice and came with ill intent. And so there was this assumption that he was choosing to respond the way that he was responding. He knew how to respond in social situations and was just subsequently choosing to respond the way he was responding when dysregulated. And so, and I could have that in hindsight, right? Um, but all I knew was with my own, in my own parent world of research of pragmatics, that, you're absolutely incorrect. I had the opportunity to observe my son in his after school setting. And so I knew the pragmatics, even before the diagnosis, I knew the pragmatics was
Sure.
a struggle. I didn't know what it was called, but I knew that was a struggle. And I think that's what gets to that other side of when you're at the table and there's this person, because oftentimes when I talk to my parents, they name things, and I'm sure you've had this happen too, Lisa, where they name things and there is a name for that. They just know this is a barrier for my child. This
Right.
is something my child struggles with, or this is somewhere my child excels. And they don't have a name for it. And then because of our experience and us being at the table and doing our research as advocates to support our families, or dealing, with our own neurodivergent learners, we have the ability to go, that's called motor planning. That's called, right?
Right.
Able to give
Right.
them those names. And so I think sometimes that's when that damage occurs too, because this person is saying this is not a struggle, and the parents going, I've watched this be a struggle for 4 years.
Right.
And I think it's good that you brought OT to the forefront, because there's often this issue too, right, between private services versus
Yes.
school services. And so
Yes.
sometimes I've found where that individualized piece gets left out. And so subsequently, because the individualized piece gets left out, we find ourselves going, no, like that is still within your school-based purview.
Right.
Um, and then there are times where I have had, based on a staff member's perception at the table, I've just had to be honest with the parent and say, do you want them
Right.
providing this service? I've had, and again, as we discussed, I'm a practicing licensed mental health professional. And I have had to at times say, like, I do not think that they should be providing this service to your learner.
Right.
And the parent is like, that's how I was feeling, but it's nice to have that confirmation. I was like, just the way, and actually the other day in a meeting I just said, they're like, well, we think, consultation and indirect, da, 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 blah, 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 because, we're not, play therapy. And then the way they spoke about play therapy and things like that, which you have to be a registered play therapist, but you can use play therapy techniques. But the way in which they broached the topic for me was a way of them expressing, I am inexperienced in this area, without actually saying I'm inexperienced in this area. And so subsequently, I just said in the meeting, which they then got defensive, but stayed the course of the recommendation. But I just said, just outright, I was like, it doesn't seem like they're qualified to do this. And so I would recommend that you just let them indirectly consult with the staff, because they don't seem to be qualified to provide the service. And they were like, well, no, you said it yourself, right? And like you did. And so I think that's another piece of it too, when we start talking about, like, sometimes it doesn't come out maliciously, right? It doesn't come out like this person is attacking the learner in a sense. Sometimes it just comes out as them saying the thing out loud, which also subsequently lets me know that you're also not open and curious and willing to learn. And so you have decided this service that we feel would be beneficial for this learner is something I can't provide because I'm unwilling to do my due diligence. And this particular provider made it very clear that the bulk of their background was with older learners and talk therapy. And so I, being a mental health professional, was very able to see and point out in the meeting for everyone to hear, and to the parents, they can't help your learner in a direct capacity. They can
Yeah.
indirectly apply educational knowledge that they garnered from their educational career, but they have nothing to add of direct value. And sometimes that's the call you have to make too, when they express that and you realize that has the potential for harm.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in the case with this OT, they were so unwilling to budge. They went back to the consult thing, and I basically said, like, that's the bare minimum. We will be revisiting this with the middle school team, and perhaps that's the path we will take, or perhaps we'll explore our rights within the procedural safeguards. And that's yet to be determined. That's a conversation that the parent and I will be having offline. But what was really interesting in that meeting is that I heard from multiple team members who were
Mm-hmm.
very respectful, but you could tell there was they were really curious to
Mm-hmm.
learn about motor planning and motor
Right.
differences and how that impacts kind of their area of expertise.
Absolutely.
Because as they were giving their present levels, there was such a deep ethic of care, but there was lack of knowledge,
Right.
right? They were seeing things that they weren't understanding,
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't want to say that like this was a choice, but they kind of didn't really know how to conceptualize, right? And so
Right. You don't know what you don't
you don't
know.
know what you don't know. And so by lifting that up and sort of grounding it in what they had said, it was
Mm-hmm.
like this aha moment. And so I know from at least the seat I'm sitting at an IEP table, I would rather have the learner with a curious provider, even if it's not technically their like area of expertise, being willing to
Right.
consider these barriers to access and what they can do to accommodate, than
Right.
having them with somebody that supposedly has the right title, but is
Mm-hmm.
absolutely unwilling to engage in any sort of curious or reflective practice. And so what's interesting in this kind of situation where it is a related service provider, especially, and I mean, I think OTs and the perspective they bring is invaluable in most situations. I really do.
Absolutely.
But in terms of sort of the hierarchy within an IEP process, they are often not viewed with the same level of respect that they should be, because they are truly a quote unquote related service, right? A speech language pathologist, there's an eligibility category tied to that service. And so they're sometimes given more status, I'll say, at an IEP table. An OT, and this is terrible, but they like in practice, like they don't necessarily have the same kind of standing or status as say a school psychologist or the classroom teacher or the principal or even the speech path, right? And so I see parents kind of dismiss the most, but in terms of the IEP team members, or excuse me, school team members, the the member who's dismissed the most is the OT. So if the OT is the one that's showing up and kind of sabotaging the situation, that's actually easier to circumvent than it is if it's the teacher of record or if it's the director of special education, right? Or the program specialist or somebody who has perceived or real higher status in this process. And so sometimes the advocacy work of kind of questioning, especially if it's a person with higher status that's sort of being that gatekeeper, kind of questioning them using data and like their own findings to say this makes no sense. I've seen that actually empower other members of the team to use their voice and step up and say, you know what, I need to do right by this learner, and I'm going to put my fear of like kind of retribution to the side, and I'm going to stand up and say this is what this learner needs. And I had totally lost what my second thought was, but it just came back. And for those of you that are watching this on YouTube, if you've seen me like turn to the side and yell, it's because my dog will not stop barking. So I don't know if you can hear it on the recording or not. She's finally quieted down. But I've had to yell her name a couple of times. So just if anybody's wondering what I'm doing, or if you could faintly hear it in the background. But the thought that I had as you were talking about data and using data to sort of like bring things to the forefront, I've had situations where I hate to pick on school psychologists, and I'm really not trying to pick on school psychologists, but unfortunately, the examples that keep coming to mind are school psychologists, where they've done an assessment, um, but like they haven't necessarily done an observation. So they're going and interviewing a classroom teacher, and the classroom teacher is saying ABC or XYZ is happening in my classroom, good, bad, or otherwise. And they're relying on that instead of their own observation. And actually, in all fairness, I've seen other related service providers do this as well. So I'll spread the love. Um, but sometimes there's a lack of data. And there's an ego that shows up that's like, oh, well, I've done these tests a million times, or I did everything else and I talked to the teacher and like it's kind of good enough and I know what I'm talking about and I'm going to come in with that stance of I'm right. But it's like you didn't even really take the time to like do a comprehensive enough assessment, right? Like sometimes my cousin will say this, it's not what people say, it's what they don't say. Sometimes in an evaluation process, it's not what you evaluated, it's what you didn't evaluate.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, what didn't you consider? What questions didn't you ask? What process didn't you engage in? That really kind of tells the story that your ego is entering that. I mean, this probably should have been in the last episode, but it's coming into my brain now. Like, your ego is showing up in this way in the process. But then,
Mm-hmm.
like, are you going to be the person that then shows up at the IEP table having not really done your part to be curious?
Mm-hmm.
And there will be other people there that have, and then like you're the one throwing off that dynamic.
Mm-hmm. But you're also talking about how role can have a significant impact,
Mm-hmm.
right? That one person not doing their due diligence, not being curious, not being open can really skew the data
Oh
and
yeah.
impact what the learner has access to. And I'm thinking of a case that I had, um, and the learner is now doing virtual schooling and doing great. But they were going to a brick and mortar, um, and their PDA freshman year of high school. And initially the team was very, I mean, special education director was at every meeting. We had so many meetings, can't even count. And initially the team was very like, well, there's got to be consequences and there's got to be this, there's got to be that. But if you're not watching, Lisa was rolling her eyes. On the other side of that,
It happened automatically.
it as it should. On the other side of that, they were like understanding of like, let's make the schedule start out with this particular subject that the learner can exert energy and enjoys and to get him to access school, and let's start out with this and that. And what the hurdle was the principal,
Mm.
who, this is how things go, this is my school, this is how this show runs, this is how it's going to be, and this is how it's going to go, period, in the story. And what happened is we were subsequently going through these meetings and doing these things, the rest of the team took the PDA training and learned and was growing and using the language in an authentic way, to where we were like, okay, we're making traction. And still, this principal was just, every time you think you've been over a hurdle, he would just say something else. And what was interesting was the special education director was almost kind of defaulting a little bit, because this is your area. This is your place. This is your house, right? The school. And so I have to be mindful of law, which she was very much making sure was not being overrode, but subsequently acknowledging this is your building, and you will be the one making the consequence decisions in that regard. And unfortunately, we got to a point where we had figured out pretty early on this learner would benefit from some type of virtual or hybrid. Um, but we were given that autonomy and still working the plan and trying and getting things in place. And then eventually the learner themselves started to enter burnout and was essentially just like, yeah, I want to do this, but I want the option of going back to brick and mortar one day, which we're like, of course. Um, and we were subsequently glad because of the harm we knew was happening with this principal. But, that example comes to mind for me because that for me was a true example. I mean, the team was, again, just adjusting. The language started out very much of like, this is a choice and we're doing all the things and they just don't want to do this. And we had started getting them to discuss, to start saying capacity and recognizing window of tolerance and understand. And it was just a shift. And yet you had this one team, and every time you would propose something that remotely did not fit that compliance-based model or narrative, it
Right.
was like, well, I don't know that we can, and I was actually very happy, and parents and I were very happy. Like, I actually got him to shut up for like 2 meetings. For 2 meetings, he sat there and didn't say shit. And it was
That's what
love
we like.
because I had to tell him off. And I
Right.
I was just like, this is ridiculous. I was like, you're not hearing what anyone is saying. You're
Right.
this and that. And what was interesting with the dynamic was, even though, like, when we talked about like some of that ignorance, right? The team was coming from a compliance-based approach, but not an unwillingness to learn and adapt.
Right.
and
Right.
the principle was just, this, it's how it's going to be. And so we would see that even when we make great decisions and accommodations and rewriting of behavior plans, and we would still end up with a phone call or a write up or a call home, which lit down on fire one day, where he called and said, like, basically was like, he was so respectful and compliant today. And dad was like,
That's funny. I'm not about to be respectful or compliant.
right. And he was like, okay, thank you for the call. And he's like, he hung up and he was like, I am so mad. Like, because he was just like, what are you talking about?
Right.
And so that for me was like that clear cut example. And in that instance, unfortunately, the burnout was starting, and we were trying to be preventative, weren't able to. The learner recognized for themselves, we were able to get them in a better position. But that's an example too, where we go back to, you know, that one person, and really this goes back to the power they wield and how
Yes.
impactful that could be. And so it was very clear, even like the case manager, because that was when I came into the case, I realized I didn't know who the case manager was, because the principal was leading the meeting. And that's when I was like, hold on. Everyone had introduced themselves, and I said, well, I want to hear from the case manager.
Right.
And so as I continued to ask questions of everyone except for the principal, who had nothing of value to add in that regard, um, he subsequently quieted down as the time went on, because he again was wielding that power and that ego of, I'm in this position, I'm your boss, and I run this show, even with the special education director in the room.
Yeah. No, I've had a similar experience and a similar kind of follow-up conversation with the director where they were like, thankfully, fairly transparent, where they were recognizing their role and sort of the chain of command, and that technically the principal doesn't report to them, so to speak. And um, but I was appreciative of the director because they were willing to be somewhat transparent in acknowledging where the gaps were and where the challenge points were. And I have a few kind of district level folks where they're really willing to kind of call it out.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's not in the meeting itself, like we'll have sort of a follow-up conversation where we leave a meeting, something went sideways, parents are like, hey, what do we do? And I'm like, hey, why don't we request a
Mm-hmm.
follow-up with the program specialist or with the director, like whoever it was that was at the meeting, to see if we can, or a phone call or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And sometimes in those moments, sort of outside of the space of the meeting itself, you'll get some transparency around like a recognition of the dynamic, where those challenge points are, what they're trying to do to sort of shift the dynamic,
Right,
etc.
right.
Because in a situation like what you're describing, and again, not an attorney here, but I really feel like you start to toe the line of denying FAPE
Mm-hmm.
when you have this agreed upon program that has certain accommodations in place or has a behavior plan that has like that kind of A to B to Z, A to B to C to D kind of, I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
it's getting late. My brain's starting to falter. um, plan in place. And if you have a site administrator that's kind of like, I don't really care what's in your plan, these are the rules on my campus,
Mm-hmm.
they become a liability. And so that director then is like, how do I reconcile this kind of tricky dynamic of like, yes, this is your house, so to speak, but
Mm-hmm.
also the choices you're making are making the district a liability, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's now dancing into we're out of compliance with this
Right.
legal document that we have
And
all
and in
of.
this situation, what was happening is subsequently, like, there were not suspensions. There were just write-ups, adding to the file, adding to the, if we were
Right,
to try and move to another school, this would be a problem. Yeah.
right. So it's tricky, but I think that hopefully today's conversation sort of highlighted how that can show up, how
Mm-hmm.
that one or two voices can really sort of undergird or undercut what would
Mm-hmm.
otherwise be a lovely collaborative, like nuanced, let's be thought partners kind of process.
Right, right.
And how, depending on where that dissension or ego is coming from, how to navigate it, because it really unfortunately does kind of matter
It really
what
does.
seat that person is in. And if it's somebody that's really kind of high status, has
Mm-hmm.
power or perceived power, it's a trickier dynamic
Mm-hmm.
than if it's somebody who wields kind of less power.
Absolutely. And I also think too, we highlighted that there's really, there's different types of power too, in that there is where you sit in making a decision or a call that can make someone uncomfortable on the team or feel like they can't speak up, with that hierarchy and that, chain of command, so to speak. And then there is the power that you wield as far as the harm to the learner for access based on your title and your role and the benefit that your knowledge could bring to the team, and subsequently someone else having to provide knowledge from a non, credentialed professional in that role standpoint. Like Lisa noted, we always know, what we are and what we are not. We're very transparent about that.
Sure.
And so when you are not curious and you bring ego to the table and you are unwilling to learn and listen to the rest of the team, you take away your expertise that could benefit the learner. And now everyone is kind of stuck essentially researching for themselves and trying to figure out how to apply it.
Yeah.
And that can cause real harm.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely.
So hopefully you guys listen to these episodes. Like I said, one after the other. You got some good information. Lisa and I are actually on the same time zone right now. And we are both sundowning. But I think, but we definitely, I think, got across what we wanted to cover for these two episodes. And really, again, as always, we just want everyone to be open and listening and willing to learn. And if you spot this and you see this and it calls to you to change it, if you spot this and you see this and see it in yourself, it happens. And so it's just be willing to learn and be willing to change. And we'll see you on our next episode.
We'll see you on our next episode.
Thank you again for joining us here in the Affirming Village. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff and Lisa Wright, and we hope today's conversation leaves you feeling seen, supported, and better equipped to advocate for yourself or your learner. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this with someone else in the village. Until next time, keep advocating, keep affirming, and keep building the village we all deserve.